So, this on? This on? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming on this beautiful warm day that's even warmer in here. I'm Joe White. I'm the director of the Center for Policy Studies and Luxembourg Family Professor of Public Policy and organizer of events for the Center for Policy Studies. And I am really, really pleased to be able to present to you today two of our really interesting scholars here at the Case Western Reserve University. Lee Hoffer from the Department of Anthropology and Michael Clune from the Department of English, to talk about something on which they both, which is important and on which they both have pretty unique and valuable perspectives. There appears to be a new heroin epidemic. There has been a substantial increase in incidence of heroin usage and in deaths, particularly in Northeast Ohio, from heroin usage over the past decade. Something that I thought of as, something in a Lou Reed song, that maybe we moved beyond. Apparently not. And so I thought it would be, and there have been, this has at a national level become more prominent because of, I guess, sentinel events, such as the deaths of Corey Moncrief and Philip Seymour Hoffman. But as I said, it's pretty close to home as well. So it seems something that we should discuss on campus. I am afraid it may be a little too close to individual lives for comfort. And heroin use is an individual phenomenon, right? There's a user, and for whatever the user's purposes and whatever effects on the user. And it is a social phenomenon. There's social effects, on the user's family and on other people, but there's also, one has to have a market. One has to have, there are structures of human life built around being a user of the drug and procuring the drug and so on. And we have on campus in Professors Clune and Hoffer, people with, fantastic perspective on both sides of this. Professor Clune, as a user, very distinguished professor of English and an amazing publication record. I can say that because I was on the promotion and tenure committee when his tenure case was reviewed. Really brilliant writer and all that. But he also, on the side, not as part of being an English professor, wrote this book, Whiteout: The Secret Life of Heroin, about his experience. Professor Hoffer has been studying drug markets since the early 1990s when he did a very long-term anthropological study of the Larimer area of Denver, and also published the overview of that research as a book, and has been continuing to work on the question of, basically how people procure heroin and what one can do about that and so on since then. So particularly the social side. And I don't want to make this too much of a false dichotomy here, right? Because you don't understand the social side unless you understand the incentives of the individuals, and you don't understand individuals unless you understand the milieu of the heroin life. But I do think that Professor Clune and Professor Hoffer offer really unique and valuable perspective in these dimensions. So the way this is going to work is I've asked each of them to teach for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to pretend I'm James Lipton or something and pose a few questions to them and try to get them discussing with each other a little, and then we'll open it up some more for your questions. Because we are trying to record this, because we are recording this, as far as we know, when you ask questions, and because we only have one microphone, when you ask questions, I will restate the question back for the taped audience, and also so that in case anybody else had trouble hearing. So with that, I would like to turn over the microphone, literally, to Professor Clune.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Joe. Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. Thanks, Joe and Lee, for having this. I think it's timely, obviously. As Joe said, I come at this from my personal experience as a heroin addict, but I want to talk a little bit about the book that I wrote about it and about my process of coming to understand what my experience meant, right? So as an addict, I knew very little about addiction, right? I was sort of like the last person whose experience would be, whose sense of my own experience would be useful to people seeking to understand the disease of addiction. So if you'd asked me what addiction was all about, 13 years ago, you wouldn't have gotten anything very interesting, right? My process of writing about this happened after being clean and in recovery for a number of years. And when I wrote this book, what I tried to do was to bring my own experience into contact with both with my experience of addiction from the perspective of recovery, of living in recovery, and also to bring that experience into contact with scientific research and neuroscientific research in particular on the disease. So I want to just very briefly get things started by talking a little bit about the understanding of what addiction is all about that emerged from the process of writing about my experience with addiction. And again, I do want to stress that, because sometimes I think that gets lost. Just because I have experience at something, right, doesn't mean that my first-person account of that will offer any knowledge, right? As a literature professor and as someone who thinks a lot about what writing is and what writing does, I'm very interested in the passage from experience to knowledge and how writing can communicate and create knowledge. But I'll share a little bit of the end points, what I sort of discovered through that process, and I'd be happy to entertain questions about the process if that's of interest to anyone. So when we talk about addiction as a disease, right? And this is something that is often counterintuitive to people, right? For a long time, people thought that what addiction was about was that I did something, a drug or gambling or sex or whatever else. I had some consequences from it, but I liked the way it made me feel, therefore I continued to do it, right? This is a model that maybe, is a sort of common sense model, like, heroin makes you feel good, you love the way it makes you feel, you don't like getting arrested and going to jail and all that kind of stuff and selling your TV and all that kind of stuff, but you like to feel good and that's why you do it, right? Turns out that's completely wrong. And actually that's the idea of what addiction was about that I had when I was an addict. And I'll talk a little bit about the way that addiction, part of what it does is it distorts one's own understanding of what one is doing, right? So what research has, over the last 2 to 3 decades, research has shifted from what the drug does when you take it, in other words, the way it makes you feel when you take it, to how the addict perceives the drug when they see it, right? Because the truth is, and this became true to me, clear to me once I reflected on my own experience of addiction. After a while, the drug high really kind of started to suck, right? It wasn't that great, right? It really stopped working for me. And you hear a lot of people describe that experience. It no longer gave me the feelings that it once gave me, right? So now I'm continually doing things and sacrificing and running risks in order to get a drug that doesn't make me feel much of anything, right? That's why we talk about it as a disease, right? So the question became why, the question of what the disease is shifted from the way it makes you feel to the way I perceive, as an addict, I perceive the addictive object. Why, after quitting heroin for so many, and I probably kicked heroin maybe 12, 14 times, something around there, but I always went back to it. And the question is, what was it that always drew me back, right? And it is something to do with the way the addictive object looks, with the way what I think when I see it. When I see, and I'm also an ex-smoker, and sometimes that's a useful, because more people are smokers than heroin addicts, it's a useful means I use to illustrate this, right? If one of you had like dropped a cigarette pack out of your pocket, right? My eyes, as an ex-smoker, would be drawn to it, and it would have a kind of salience and a kind of intensity, the image of the cigarette pack, that nothing else has for me, right? I would also tend to look at that image and associate it with a kind of pleasure that smoking once gave me, like in the distant, distant past, right? So when I see my drug of choice, when I think about my drug of choice, what I see and what I experience is that first time, those great early memories of addiction, right? And it's like I'm unable to retain a really vivid memory of the pain and all the suffering that addiction caused in my life, right? So that's really the interesting piece about what addiction is and why we talk about it as a disease, right? Like if I was doing drugs and like I liked the way it made me feel and I had consequences, you know, you sort of have a hard time calling that a disease, right? It might be stupid, I might have like lack of willpower or whatever. But if I'm going back and back and back to something that, despite the consequences, actually doesn't make me feel much of anything, then we want to think of that as a kind of pathology rather than a choice. So that's a little bit about you know what it means when we think about addiction as a disease, right? As something that you know is different than just a set of choices, a set of bad choices that people might choose to make. Why I, as a writer, why did I write this book? You know, there's been lots of books about addiction. As a writer and as a scholar of literature, I'm very interested in the way images work, right? And in particular, artists and writers since the Romantic period have been obsessed by the idea of creating an image that will never get old, that won't wear out, that will continue to radiate the freshness and intensity that image possesses the first time you see it, right? This is an object. As a writer, I want to create sentences, I want to create images that have that retain that kind of intensity over time. Now, by putting the problem that way, it should be easy to see now that the addictive object actually has that quality, right? The addictive object does what literature, art, and writing since the Romantic period has really tried to do, right? It is an image that for me, for any addict, never gets old, never wears off, never loses its fascination, no matter how many times you see it. So when you know, after a while, I read a bunch of addiction literature, and I was sort of thinking, you know, there's something that's missing in the way people are characterizing this disease, and I decided to write a book to see if I couldn't test my own intuition about what was missing by exploring it through writing, and that's for better or worse what I did. Thanks.
Well, thank you. It's always fun trying to follow Michael. My name is Lee Harper. I want to start by thanking Joe and Michael for putting this together. It's very interesting. Like Joe was saying, I started doing research in sort of the early 90s, mid 90s on drug addiction, and I have to say that I basically took a job as a graduate student. That's how I became interested. So nothing fancy. And so I'm an anthropologist, and so I use maybe different methods than some people might be aware of. So as anthropologists, we study cultures, and we do that by using basically two methodologies, one sort of open-ended interviewing and what's called participant observation or field work. And so since the 90s or so, what my job has been is to basically hang out essentially with people who are addicted to various drugs, and I've studied all kinds of drugs, but mostly heroin, and try to understand what that life is like outside of, you know, a formal context when someone's at a clinic or when someone's maybe coming in for an interview. We try to get out there and sort of understand what are the sort of social contexts involved. You know, how does this what is this lifestyle like? What are things that people that are addicted to, in this case heroin, what do they have to deal with? How do they sort of understand their reality as maybe being different from a person who isn't addicted? And I basically started this work by becoming very interested in the population. So when I first started doing interviews, I was doing survey interviews initially. And what I realized is I was finding out a lot more when I was informally just chatting with the people that were coming into the interviews to do the surveys than I was actually in the surveys. Surveys were interesting. We were doing HIV prevention research at the time, trying to understand the injection, primarily the drug injection risk behaviors associated with injecting heroin. But I was really interested in, I was in sort of a graduate student in anthropology, and so I was like, well, you know, this ethnography stuff, this kind of sounds fun. Maybe I can do this with some of the participants. And I lucked out to have a very good mentor who allowed me to just sort of go out and do my thing. And it was really fascinating to get to know people in this way because, you know, when these were, at the time I was in Denver, I was fairly much younger than I am now, and a lot of the users were much older than I was, and sort of they took me under their wing and, you know, wanted to sort of educate me about what the life was like, and this was quite an education. And so from that point, I sort of got to know 2 heroin users who were just sort of street-based, homeless, sort of almost stereotypical, if you will, heroin users who became dealers. And so when they became dealers, I was like, well, this sounds like a good dissertation project. I will hang out with them and watch what they do all day while they sell drugs and they interact with their customers. And so I did this for about 18 months. I was given basically open access to their business. And I tell people, you know, it wasn't glamorous. I essentially hung out in a kitchen where the dealers were selling heroin, and I would interview them about the interactions that they had with their customers, and then I would interview their customers along the way and follow their lives as much as I could within the course of my research. And so as anthropologists, we try to understand sort of what life is like outside of sort of these formal contexts where we understand things like addiction or drug use. And this is sort of the pattern that, or the methodology that I've used throughout my work, both in Colorado. After Colorado, I went to Washington University in St. Louis at the School of Medicine there and was doing some research on, we did research on club drug use, on how people misuse study drugs, and interviewed people on inhalant use, sort of studied all kinds of drugs, but sort of it's always coming back, unfortunately, to heroin for me. When I came here, we did a study, an NSF study on sort of the heroin market, of how people basically buy and sell the drug, what's involved with those interactions and exchanges, and how people sort of understand the business side of drug use, or sort of supporting their drug habits, some of which can be fairly large and very expensive. And so, but these are fairly small studies. The ends, you know, usually we have 30, 40 people in our studies, and we usually interview them anywhere from 4 or 5 times to 10 times over the course of, you know, maybe a year or 2 years. And so we try to get in-depth information from folks, and then we go out and do participant observations. So we have to convince them that we aren't the police, and that we can we could just shadow them and sort of go hang out with them and sort of follow their daily routine. And we try to learn that and incorporate those lessons into things like interventions, talks like this, where we're trying to sort of influence policy or talk to policymakers about what life is like for people that are sort of in the grips of addiction here. So I think that's about it. If you're interested, I have to put in a plug. I do teach a class, Illegal Drugs in Society. I see some of my students here, but and where we really sort of get into it. And I'm not, you know, my dad's a neuropharmacologist. I'm not really interested in how drugs affect the brain other than sort of in a very basic way. I'm really interested in trying to understand the behavior and the relationships that people have within this context. You know, drug users, believe it or not, aren't socially isolated. They aren't all schizophrenics. A lot of them are fairly normal, don't look any different than you or I. They get into drugs in very benign ways, as Michael's book, I think, points out. There's nothing sort of special in a lot of these circumstances. You can't tell a drug user or a heroin user walking down the street, and this is my job, I do this for a living, and so I can tell you that that's very difficult to do. So I think that this kind of forum is nice. It's just sort of, you know, talk about some of the different things that that sort of is involved with, especially in this particular, in this case, heroin.
So I'd like to start with a somewhat obvious question. I mean, Lee, you've been looking at this for about 20 years now. Michael, for at least 15. When we talk about the new epidemic, are there new addicts? Are the pathways into addiction and who becomes an addict different now from what they were from before?
So I think the answer to that is yes and no. So everybody is aware that over the last, I guess, maybe 4 or 5 years, there's been sort of an increase in the use of prescription opiates and the misuse of prescription opiates. I think this was sort of a clear sort of precursor to the current trend that we're in now for heroin. However, there have been other heroin epidemics. Heroin sort of seems to come and go. It's sort of interesting. There seems to be, there's anthropologists talk about this intergenerational amnesia when it comes to drug trends, where people sort of forget that the drug has these are powerful substances and you can get addicted to them. I think in this particular case, the epidemic does seem to be hitting primarily white and young users much more than other epidemics, although I can remember in the 90s in Baltimore there was a big epidemic of heroin and it was the exact same population. And so I think that a lot of times we have this notion that the people that are addicted to heroin are black or brown, when in fact the majority of the people that I've interviewed throughout the entire time I've done my work have been white. So, and a lot of them are employed. A lot of them come from fairly middle class, if you will, backgrounds. So I think that sort of some of the stereotypes that we have about epidemics and about sort of who the users are in this particular case could be reshaped a little bit.
Yeah, I'd agree with what Lee said, and I'll just add, my own experience with heroin addiction in Ohio is, I'd been, when I moved here in 2010, I'd been clean for 10 years, right? So I didn't know anyone who was using, but I've been involved in, volunteer work with addicts for a number of years now, and in various ways. And let me just give a plug to the Case Recovery House. If you know anyone who is struggling with addiction or is looking for recovery meetings. We have a facility here which is has those meetings and is very supportive. It's actually a very supportive environment for people. And
what's it called again?
The Case Western Reserve Recovery House.
Okay.
Yeah, you can. yeah. I'm on the board, and you are too, right? Yeah, it's a great place. So through my work there and in other places. I have noticed a difference in the kinds of people that are showing up as heroin addicts. First of all, there's a lot more of them than I had seen. I've lived in, I've been clean. I've lived in, Chicago, Baltimore, Ann Arbor, Florida, various places. What's different is, and this might be familiar to you, but the Oxycontin and prescription opiate abuse, which was a real, which, as Lee said, has been a real issue for a long time now. Once authorities really started cracking down on the pill mills, what happened was a lot of people ended up, they lost their connection. I've heard this story over and over and over again. They lost their connection to get pills, and then they decided to go to heroin, right? Someone said, hey, this is the same thing, and it's cheaper, and it's stronger, and so forth. And so they sort of transitioned from an addiction to pills to an addiction to heroin. Now, pharmacologically, they're very, very similar, but the kinds of networks of use and the kind of health risks are quite different, right? So a lot of people who got into it were people who thought, taking a pill is no big deal, right? I've taken Vicodin before, I'll just take some of this, and they find themselves hooked, and then they end up on a drug that they probably never would have gotten to sort of, directly, right? So that's what I've noticed, and a lot of them are super young too, who are coming in, which is disturbing to me that it seems to be really prevalent in the high schools, which was not the case when I was growing up. There was like no heroin in high school. Now in this area, it seems to be the case. So that to me is a worrisome feature that I haven't necessarily seen before. So.
Just to speak on that transition, I think, so the study that we did here ended about a couple of years ago, and we were studying for about 3 years. So we were sort of in the height of this transition, and all of the participants in my study, this is true, it's an N of 38, all of them transitioned from opiate medications to heroin. And you think, well, how do they do this? Well, a lot of times it was a surgery. You know, they had a major surgery. They would get opiate medications to control the pain for this. They would use those medications for sort of longer than prescribed, or sort of we become sort of hooked on them over the course of just a couple of weeks. It doesn't really take a lot of time before when you stop using those pills, you actually get sick. Or they'd be in pain management, and they would also be recreationally using something like, maybe they would use cocaine. They would come up positive on a tox screen for cocaine, and they would get dropped from the pain clinic. Well, you know, that's a reasonable thing for a doctor to do, frankly, but when the person has a fairly large habit on an opiate, dropping them from the pain clinic, even if they've used cocaine once or they come up positive on a tox screen for cocaine, is problematic for the person, because now they have an addiction to an opiate that they're going to have to take care of. And I think that people don't quite understand that a lot of times people are just staying well when they're, you know, a lot of times people think, well, everybody's getting high on heroin, this, that, and the other. And most of the people that I interview throughout the course of my work, they're just basically staying well. I mean, there might be some euphoria from the use, but essentially what happens is you become tolerant to these drugs very quickly, as Michael was suggesting. And so you don't really feel that sort of euphoria anymore once you're using. And this happens really quickly. And so once you're on a lot of pain medication, and if you don't use the drug, you're going to get sick. It's a strong motivation to actually find some way to deal with the pain, as well as sort of going into withdrawal, avoiding it.
I'd like to follow up with a logical question about what you've been saying, and then maybe a stupid question, but a basic one. The logical question is, we've identified two relatively new things: the people who are coming from OxyContin and Percocet, and the people who are in high school. And I guess the logical question is, are these the same group, or is there some other thing that's going on? You have a lot of high school students who are using OxyContin and Percocet, or is something else going on with the high school students? The maybe obvious question is, how does it kill you? How is it that heroin kills people? And how great is the risk of that?
I mean, with the high school question, I don't know, right? I can speculate, but it would be nothing more than that. So I won't address that. For how does it kill you? Overdose obviously is the most common form of death, and it's interesting because when you're an addict, you really think, and I thought, like, my problem is that I'm physically dependent on this stuff, right? Because you get sick if you're not on it, right? And so what addicts have a really hard time understanding is that, well, you know, I was physically dependent on it, but I was able to get off it 13, 14 times, right? The real issue is, why do I get back on it, right? After I've been off it, right? That's the real issue, right? The physical dependence is in some ways a red herring, right? Addicts will tell you that's their main issue. If I can just kick it, if I can just get enough stuff to get off it, but they'll always end up back on it, right? The relapse rate is, you know, extremely high, right? So it's important to understand that in order to understand what I'm about to say next, which is the most common time to die of an overdose is after after you're free of the physical dependence. And so let's say you went into a clinic and you got some detox medication, you've been off it for a week or 2 weeks or a month or 6 months or a year, you go to prison, whatever. You get out and you immediately start doing it again, and you will misjudge how much you're able to tolerate safely, and then you overdose and die. That's very, very common. And again, it's because of relapse, not necessarily because of overdosing in the normal course of your addiction, which can happen too. You can get some bad stuff. I mean, there's lots of ways you can go, right? This stuff isn't regulated. There's fentanyl. You know, they mix it with stuff that's more potent, and there's always recurrent epidemics of people dying from bad dope and so forth. But generally, a lot of the people die because of they relapse and overdose. You know, the other part of it is death. I mean, I have a friend who speculated that. He believes that a lot of people, he's a heroin addict, he believes that a lot of people who overdose, it's suicide. that these people know how much they can tolerate, but they're choosing to commit suicide. And I have no idea how one would measure that, or if there's been any studies, or if one could do studies on it. I kind of doubt it. But it gets to something really at the heart of addiction for me, which is when you're an addict, being an addict isn't like a lifestyle choice. It's not like fun. It absolutely sucks. It's a living death. And in many ways, many people will say it's better, I'd rather be dead than go back to using heroin. Certainly I feel that way, right? It's just the way it goes. There's just nothing fun about this, right? I mean, I talk about this because the New Yorker did a review of my book. It was a very positive review, but one of the things they said was, Clune describes this in a way that really makes us, want to do it or want to feel that feeling. And so I always try to stress whenever I give interviews or talks, correct that misunderstanding, which I think is an easy misunderstanding to have, which is the reality is doing drugs all the time isn't about being high all the time. If it was about being high all the time, wouldn't that be that bad, right? You might have some consequences. You might, have some issues or whatever, but it wouldn't be that bad. But that's not the reality. The reality is you're continually in a state of desperation and quasi-suicidal ideation almost constantly, right? That's the reality of addiction. It's not fun, and you're not getting high, and it sucks, right? So that's why we call it a disease. So both the actual deaths, right, which are extraordinary and mounting and so forth, but then also just the quality of one's life, the degradation of the quality of one's life, and thirdly, which is something we haven't talked about yet, is if you're a heroin addict, the chances of you ever getting clean and getting sustained recovery are extraordinarily low. People continually overestimate how effective treatment is. It is not very effective. It does work. It worked for me. It works for other people, but it's not that effective. And we're lying to ourselves if we pretend that it is. Not doing it is really the key to saving lives in my view.
Just to follow up on a couple themes there, one of the things I really like about Whiteout is this notion of time. So the people that I have sort of interacted with who are addicted to heroin, they wake up on the clock, right? So you have to, it's not a function of whether or not you choose to use the drug tomorrow. You wake up and you aren't feeling good, and you know that within the matter of 48 hours or 72 hours, you're going to be incapacitated. So, and one of the things I liked about the book is that there is this real emphasis on sort of you're always on the clock. Now, you just imagine if you woke up every single day and you had to, spend $20 for and you woke up with the flu every morning, or the start of the flu every morning, and you had to get medicine to get rid of the flu every day. So this is the sort of cycle, and I would agree with Michael. The people that I've interviewed, they are not happy people in any stretch of the imagination. I mean, they're constantly, even if they look like they're nodding out or they're sort of in slow motion, they are constantly got the gears going about how I'm going to get the money for my next fix, or how am I going to hustle to get at least enough drugs so I'm not throwing up or having diarrhea all over myself in later in the evening. So it's not a positive existence. And back to the suicide notion, I would agree that here too is that the dealer that I was working with, and I became very close with him. He was a friend. We would go out to dinner at night. I would play bingo with him on the weekends. So we had a close. This is how you do the ethnography: is you have to develop rapport with people before they sort of let you into their world. And we were fairly close. He basically just killed himself. And so, and watching that, being there, not being able to do anything. I mean, I said, anytime you want to go to treatment, I'll take you to treatment. But he knew that treatment was, his lifestyle depended on him selling heroin. So it's not something that he's going to get out of his life at that point. And he was a drinker, and so if you pile on the CNS depressants, your heart stops, among other things you can do. But and he killed himself. He went into the VA from a sort of an overdose. He got out. He was actually clean for a while, and he realized his life was just total crap. He couldn't escape. He was doing about so. heroin is sold in various quantities, and a gram is really sort of the big quantity. Maybe sells for maybe 110, 120 bucks, depending sort of on where you are. And it's a full syringe, usually full of heroin mixed with water. And he was using 2 or 3 grams a day, because he was a dealer and it was fairly cheap for him to do that. But that is a lot of heroin to be using. And his life was it was a sort of a dealer's habit. But his life was not fun, ever. So these are the only times, that he had a good time, was when he used to sort of take a break from it. And I remember his pager, it was back in the days of pagers, I don't know. His pager was always beeping when we were going out to bingo, and he would turn it off and get really mad because he needed a break. There was no break from that lifestyle for him, period. And he was a success. I mean, he had all the heroin that he needed, at any point. So he wasn't going to get arrested for that. He had a sort of a good operation, so.
In a way, this sounds like I won't say much more serious, but a different version of the discussions of tobacco and of nicotine, where, once you get in on it, it's very hard to get off it. And so that means that a lot of the emphasis in tobacco policy is to stop people from smoking at all, just try to keep them from ever doing it. And so, in particular, with what's going on right now with in the high schools and so on. One common idea is, just say no campaigns. What do you think of that, or of alternative approaches to trying to prevent people from starting?
The just a no campaign was a disaster. I mean, but I remember being, 8 or whatever, and seeing the just say no ads and being like, I really want to do that. I want to say yes. I mean, like, if someone says no, it's just like, it's like really simple. Sort of amazing they did that ad campaign. It's like, it's really foolish. It's like a real basic psychology, right? I mean, if that's why, like, saying swear words in, like, high school classrooms was always so funny and awesome, right? Because you're not allowed to say it, right? In everyday life, I can swear all I want to, and I don't swear that often because it's not that great. You know what I mean? So that kind of a prohibition functions really to endow the prohibited object with a kind of allure that it might not necessarily otherwise have. So I think we've gotten better with messaging, right? With ways of educating people, right? Of why one wants to stay away from this stuff. One of the things about opiates is, the people who tend to get addicted to opiates are the people who have access to opiates, right? It's a super addictive drug. And so, I see a lot, like in working with addicts, I see a lot of nurses and pharmacists, right, and so forth, right? People who have access, or those populations are going to get addicted. It's just a drug that a certain amount of people, if 10 people take it, a certain amount of those people are just going to get addicted to it. So, and again, and this is important to keep in mind, always really important to keep in mind, treatment doesn't work that well at all. So, and America has a hard time with that, right? I mean, the fact that the war on cancer hasn't improved survival rates very much over the last 4 decades is something that people resist. Same with addiction. The idea that we don't have a real successful treatment regime for addiction also is something that is sometimes hard for us to admit. But we do need to admit it when we're thinking about policy, because my sense is that we still do need to focus on restricting access to these drugs, right, as well as educating people, right, on why it's not good to pick it up, right. But sometimes some people advocate legalization or something like that, and again, the reason that I'm sort of opposed to that kind of direction is they'll often say, well, we'll put a lot of the money that we save on law enforcement into treatment. And if treatment was even like 30% effective, maybe that would work, right? If it was even 20% effective, maybe that would work. If it was even like 10% effective, maybe that would work. But it's not, right? It'd be great if it was 10% effective, but it's not. So, so restriction has to be part of the message, and as well as education. And as Lee said, there is that kind of generational amnesia, right, where people will. Everyone in a certain generation will, people will run through the cycle, and knowing their friends and associates and so forth go down the tubes with heroin, and then a generation later it comes back, right? So trying to interrupt that, or trying to preserve that memory, or communicate that, is, I think, part of the answer. But it's obviously a difficult problem.
Yeah, I guess I sort of differ maybe a little here. I really think the current state of prevention is pathetic, frankly. So how many people have been in theyre? This is sort of the theyre generation, right? So everybody in my class who's been in theyre, I ask them all these questions about theyre. How is theyre? And, to a person, they have said, oh, well, it doesn't really work. It let me know, I learned all about what drugs that I wanted to use, or, all these sort of negative things. And the problem isn't so much the program as it is the messaging. So the messaging is, you use cocaine once, you're going to get addicted, or you're going to overdose, or you're going to use heroin once, you're going to die. This just isn't true. And people are smart enough to, young people are smart enough to figure it out. They can use marijuana, or they can use cocaine, and they can use heroin, and they aren't going to die tomorrow. I mean, they might, but the chances are fairly slim. And so what happens is that undermines the whole messaging process. So then it's sort of like, well, you said that, if I use cocaine once, then I'm going to be, a crack addict tomorrow. That just doesn't happen. And for most people, actually, they use drugs recreationally. It's a very small percentage of people who actually become dependent on drugs anyway. So we're talking about a small group here. So what's the solution? I think that people need young people need straight talk about it. And I don't mean straight talk like just say no straight talk. I mean just, here's the situation. These people use drugs because they feel good when they use drugs. I mean, that's why people have always used drugs. So here's what here's what's gonna happen potentially if you start using these drugs, and sort of lay it out fairly straightforwardly. So, and a lot of people think, well, younger people their brains aren't mature enough to they're risk takers. They and you have to sort of be careful about when you just, educate, I think, people in that context. But I think just straight information about it, where you aren't trying to scare. I mean, I think people sort of have got that scare tactic, the just say no message, and it's a joke for them. So, how is that, we're spending a lot of money on this, so how is that going to help? I don't see any of the students in my classes, they say theyre was just ridiculous. And that's not to say that the police don't, or the officers that do those programs can't maybe change the messaging. I think it's just sort of a tweaking, or maybe involve some other people in the messaging. So, and then I think access, I think this is another huge issue. I think the problem with access is that it's impossible to prevent. So, people don't buy drugs. So when people start using heroin, they don't buy drugs from a dealer. They don't say, oh, you know what, I'm going to start using heroin tomorrow, and I'm going to go down the street corner, I'm going to buy this heroin from a dealer. They get it from their friends. I mean, this is how people get drugs, is, you have a friend who says, hey, you know what, I have this stuff, or, I want to find something, can you help me out? And so I think saying, to try to sort of say access is you're going to combat access, I think is tricky. And that's not to say, of course, that law enforcement isn't important here, because I think it is. So what's the solution? I think that, I really do think, even though treatment is bad, I think there are ways to give more people access to it. And to say, for example, I've studied drug treatment, you'll find people have gone in 5 or 6 times before it sort of sticks. Well, if you can lower the threshold for that entry, let people sort of test it out, lower our sort of expectation that the only, success of drug treatment is to be a non-drug user. So sort of use more sort of harm reduction policies, where maybe instead of injecting drugs, you can go back to smoking this drug. Or instead of maybe using 5 times a day, maybe you could just use once a day. And use that as your measuring stick for success. I mean, I know these aren't sort of measures that are going to please everybody, but I think that's the only way to sort of get people more interested in treatment, give more money to people to try to sort of develop new methodologies, new sort of protocols for treatment, more inpatient treatment. I said just generally more access, sort of free access to treatment. I think all these things could be helpful.
I have a ton of other questions I want to ask, but I'll only ask one of them, which is sort of a follow-up to the last one. Because on the other hand, Michael, you've just taken a pretty strong stance against just saying no. And yet, if I read your book correctly, the key recognition in your book is when you realize you don't have to say yes. That using is an affirmative action, that it's always a choice, and that it's always, and so you don't have to say yes is, in a logical sense, very similar to just say no, but it seems to be very different in practice. If you could comment, A, on if I've got this right, and B, on what do you think is going on there?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question. So, when I'm talking in my book about which is really true, is the sudden realization after being an addict that I actually had the capacity to not use drugs anymore, right? And the process that led to that choice precipitating out of the zombie-like behavior of addiction, that's quite different than I think what we were talking about before, which is before you're an addict, what can we do to nudge or influence people not to make that choice to pick up, right? Two sort of different questions, quite different questions, but I'll talk a little bit about the last one because this has to do with recovery and my experience with it. And I said, it doesn't work for most people. It doesn't work for most people, but it does work for some people. And essentially, it works for people who really are, committed to it. And what causes that commitment is an endless debate, poorly understood. But for my own experience, it was part of the process was becoming more conscious of all the little steps in all the little actions I had to take before I used, right? So if you're an addict, my experience as an addict was I would see I'd be clean for a while, I would see the drug or I would think about the drug, and it would be like a magnet that would suck me out of my situation, and like I'd all of a sudden wake up and I'd be high again and wondering what the hell happened, right? Part of the recovery process for me was learning to sort of like take a kind of, microscopic awareness of each one of my actions, right? Like, so I think about the drug, well, I'm powerless over that thought. That thought's going to come into my head, right? But what do I do next, right? I have to pick up the phone to call someone, right? I have to get in my car. I've got to go get money. There's all these steps that I have to take, and every one of those steps I could interrupt, right? So it was really about, making conscious, turning a lot of automatic behaviors into conscious behaviors, which is really kind of painful and difficult, right? I mean, so much of our life is automated. I mean, there's good evolutionary reasons for that and so forth, but the process of getting the drugs, I just had to be really, focused. And I remember having this fear of like, man, I'll just think about it and then I'll be high again, and I won't be able to do anything about it. And what people told me was, no, if you're really just thinking about what you have to do and very conscious about what you're doing, it sounds silly, right? I mean, actually, there's this motto that people use in recovery, which is if you don't pick it up, it won't get in you. Which for people who aren't users seems like crazy, right? It seems like completely obvious, right? But for people who are addicts, it's like a complete revelation, right? Hey, if I don't actually get the drug and use it, it won't get into me, right? It's like, that's like a revelation, because your experience as an addict is of walking like a zombie and just waking up again and again high, and you don't know how it happened. I mean, you hear from people, when people come back after relapsing over and over again, they'll say, I don't know what happened. I was walking along, I was walking the dog, I was watching TV, and then I was high, right? And so retraining your brain to be conscious of all those choices one has to make, or rather, taking processes that were formerly unconscious and bringing them into consciousness where they can become objects of choices. That's part of the process of recovery, right? And just by describing that to you, I think it can give you a sense of just how deep a brain disease addiction is, right? It's not, this is not a simple thing, right? It's a multi-dimensional disorder, right? Where I disagree a little bit with some of the harm prevention ideas is I believe they're based on a misunderstanding of the neuropsychology of addiction, right? Control is basically, it's very difficult for a whole variety of reasons. The method I am most interested in now, after moving to Cleveland and doing some research with some folks at the Cleveland Clinic, is there's a drug called Suboxone, right, which is it's been very controversial in the recovery community because people in recovery tend to think if you're doing any drug, you're not clean, right? You're not in recovery. You've got to be completely abstinent. Now, my story is I just got completely abstinent, right? I haven't done any kind of drug in over 13 years. So, but that's I understand that's fairly unusual, and I'm fortunate to have that experience. The people I know who've been doing best in recovery are the ones who start off on or continue on this drug Suboxone, which is sort of successor to methadone. And if there's a single policy I'd like to see implemented is that Suboxone be made more widely available. There's currently a cap of 100 patients. A doctor who prescribes Suboxone can only give it to 100 patients, right? I'm interested in expanding that number, right? Suboxone has a relatively low abuse potential, but it has an enormous potential for really getting people off heroin and other drugs, and giving them a chance to have a recovery. It doesn't equal recovery, but it gives them a chance to get recovery. So my sense of what kind of treatment and then they can learn the things about conscious choice and all the rest of it. But you can't learn any of that if you're still on the drug or if you're trying to control the drug. In my experience, and according to the data I've seen, it's that's why I'm really, and I'm not like a proponent of, I'm not going out beating the drum for Suboxone, but I am saying this is like a real, this is in my own experience of working with these guys. This is what's really working for them. Most of the people I've worked with are now dead, or in prison. The people that keep coming back and are recovering, by and large, are people who are taking this drug Suboxone. So that's my own, sense of how this might work.
I would just like to add that if you want a sense of the way the brain is working and the things it's doing to people, there are a few things that are as powerful as the section in Michael's book about how he got caught, about how he got busted. It's really a very, very powerful passage. And while the New Yorker reviewer might have thought that, and I can see why the reviewer thought this, that the sections on the attraction to the first memory of using the drug make it seem very powerful and very attractive. The section on within sight of the cops, bending down and trying to pretend to pick up something to get your fix back, in a snowy courtyard in Chicago, and then the cops' reaction. You essentially what's the word? Fool, idiot. Yeah. I mean, just the level of sort of degradation and lack of control at that point is really will certainly make you think that this is not a really good lifestyle to get into. And maybe at some level what you're talking about here is developing this feeling of control by saying, I have to say yes. Whereas when a teenager is told just say no, that's not control because those other people are telling them not to say no, and that doesn't feel like independence and control. I don't know. I'm just speculating.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So now let's open it up for other people to raise issues and so on, and I'll try to repeat them for the recording. Ma'am.
My first question is a very simple one. You talked about how treatment is not terribly effective for most people. Do you have any knowledge of what the percentages of folks that actually do make it to recovery?
Okay, so just the percentages of effectiveness of treatment of various sorts. Right. Yeah.
I think relapse rates are 80-90%. Yeah.
I just add to that. There's a guy named Jason Jerry who works at the Cleveland Clinic, and if you look up his name, he's got an article, and I forget the public. You can email me, and he describes both the difficulty of getting good statistics and the actual number that the closer they're able to get, which without using drugs like Suboxone, which is maybe 3 or 4% people getting recovery, maybe lower than that. So relapse rate over 95%. According to his study, but it's also really difficult to get a sense, and how you judge what recovery means is also, as Lee said, it's a question, right? What counts as recovery? So it's actually pretty complicated, but it's not good.
Okay, so the question is about the use of naloxone as essentially a cure in a case of overdose, and any thoughts about naloxone and its use?
Yeah, so it's an agonist, right? So it basically doesn't allow you, the opiate, to work. And it's harmless. Yeah, I could take it right now, sitting here in front of you, and have absolutely no effect. So and I know there's a House Bill 170 something or other, where they're trying to sort of distribute this more widely. I mean, give it away for free. I mean, get it out there and sell. I mean, I know the price has actually gone up since this program, since they're sort of distributing more of it, which is problematic to some degree. But give the stuff away. I mean, why should there be any restriction on it? It is not harmful at all, and it saves people. So, and I think they've distributed, I think, I was just looking at some data, I think it was 75,000 doses over the year, so.
So I'd like to try to clarify here, because the question was in terms of this being something you give to people who've had an overdose to cure them. The answer was in terms of this being something you give to people so that when they take the drug, they won't feel it, so that they won't want to take it, basically. So those are very different functions. Is it?
No, he was.
Oh, for the overdose. Okay, okay.
If you're overdosing and you squirt this up a person's nose and they're giving it to police now and everything like this, they're out of the, I mean, they get pissed because the highest done.
Okay, so what Lee was saying was if you overdose, squirt it up the person's nose, they're very upset because they're not high anymore. But maybe later on they'll thank you. I don't know. Did Michael, do you want to say anything about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think back when I was using, I think they marketed that drug under the name Revia. Am I right about that? And that was used as an agonist to block. They would give it to addicts to sort of block your, so you wouldn't be able to get high if you happen to relapse, right? Which was like completely ineffective, right? Because all you would do is like stop taking the pill, right? So totally ineffective as now again. Suboxone actually has some of that agonist in it, right? So in certain preparations, I think it could be a part of an effective treatment. But on its own, yeah, it's fantastic for preventing overdoses, and they should definitely distribute it as widely as possible, as Lee said. Pretty useless as a recovery tool.
Yeah. Okay, so question about decriminalization. We've all heard at one point or another about the Netherlands and somewhat decriminalized. So what is your feeling about decriminalization?
So I think it's tricky. I'm all for Colorado's and Washington's decriminalization of marijuana. I think this is a natural, this is actually probably going to hurt drug cartels more than heroin. But I think with heroin, there are some solutions. There are, you can actually, in the UK, people can get heroin prescribed by a doctor. They can be used in detox and various other ways, or maintenance regimes, much like methadone is now. I think there's some solutions that we could potentially look at for the US there. I think that's a ways down the road. As far as harm reduction things, stuff like needle exchange, safe injection rooms, actually drug zones where people can actually go and do their thing and not get arrested. I think these are all positive things, frankly. And I think it would be nice to see the U.S. try some of them on. I mean, needle exchange has been very successful. It's also a good tool to get to that community. This is a hidden population, folks, right? So it's very hard to sort of get access to them. Even within the context of a hospital, people will lie. They won't tell, they won't tell doctors what they're doing. So these are really nice ways to sort of get access to that population, deliver interventions, deliver medications, deliver sort of medicine, whatever it is you can get to those folks, access to treatment. These are all positive things.
Yeah, I think we'd want to distinguish between two different things, right? One is making more widely available treatments and medications and other things that aid in recovery or aid in getting people, off drugs or improving their health and so forth. And I'm all for that. As I just repeat, I'm all for increasing doctors' capacity to prescribe Suboxone, for example, right? So I'm all for that. But again, when it comes to, and I'm totally for care less about decriminalization of marijuana. That seems like a good thing, right? But when it comes to to opiates. When we make that and again, a lot of the times when I've seen, this is something that requires a lot of analysis to be able to weigh the pros and cons and think about what the consequences would be of some decriminalization measures. And a lot of the models that describe or try to project those consequences, they sort of conceal this belief in the efficacy of treatment. Right? That's part of their calculus, right? Because there's no doubt if you were to lessen some of the law enforcement procedures that are in place, the access to these drugs would increase. Everyone who does these projections agrees on that, right? And addiction goes up, right? So then it's the question of well, is the cost of having more addicts, you weigh that against the cost that we're currently paying in terms of incarceration and so forth and so on, and you try to weigh those out and do a cost-benefit analysis, right? People will often, in order to mitigate the negative social consequences of increasing addiction, is to imagine that treatment can be made more effective than it already is, and that's just a mistake. Right, so that's my only, 2 cents about that.
I guess if I could just, I totally agree that treatment's not effective, but you also have to understand that that's about a third of the drug budget is for treatment. So much more is spent, exponentially more is spent in, what's called supply reduction policies, which are essentially trying to lower demand by basically cutting off supply. Which is basically throwing people in jail. And the problem is that it's not so much, I'm not, do I think that people that are dealing heroin need to be in jail? I do believe that. But there are also these things like collateral sanctions for people who have been arrested for possession of drugs. And the collateral sanctions here are sort of 400, 500 different sort of employment categories that people that have even oftentimes misdemeanor possession charges can't get jobs in after they are done with their jail time or whatever. And so this is catastrophic. These are big costs here. So I think we need to be careful to say, well, and I agree that treatment isn't effective, but what's the alternative? So can we give it more support? Can we try be more creative here in some ways?
Let me just quickly say one more thing in response to that really important question, which is, when I say treatment isn't effective, it's obviously not effective in terms of a systematic solution, right? But it doesn't mean it doesn't work, right? And from an individual perspective, if someone is suffering from addiction, recovery really does work, right? And that's sort of the paradox. It's just that from a systematic perspective, it's not going to solve the problem, right? And that's why it's part of why actually supply reduction makes more sense than putting more money into treatment, just because it's if you look at the percentages, it doesn't add up, right? But yeah.
Seems to me that one response to the current problem would be to do a better job of pain management for the people on the OxyContin and the Percocet. This woman at the back, and then Professor Singer.
I have a question along those lines, actually. So you both touched on how this commonly travel passes from prescription opioids to heroin, and when the problem in disturbing that passes, there is a time and a place for prescription opioids. So I see sort of two populations that we have to think about. First is the opioid and heroin naive population. How do you prescribe to them appropriately and discourage them from becoming from using heroin? And then the second population is people who have a history of
Okay, so there's an interesting distinction here, which is that, if I'm understanding correctly, that there are people who end up with OxyContin or Percocet with prescription opioids, and they don't know anything about drugs. They don't know anything about opioids and opiates, and so they sort of get sucked in one kind of way, and then there may be another population, which is people who have some experience with drugs. And when they get the prescription for whatever reason, they are particularly vulnerable, or their pathway and their probabilities are going to be different, if I understand it correctly. So, and since we're probably going to be doing prescription opiate drugs for quite a while now, what on earth should we be doing about this and thinking in terms of these two different kinds of challenges, two different kinds of populations using the drugs? Who wants to start?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a really hard question. I think initially we have to talk about pain management, how people treat pain, right? There are ways to treat pain without giving people opiates. And I know that the medical community has sort of worked on this a fair amount. I think they could do a lot better on that particular count. Now, the FDA just approved this Zohydro. Has anybody heard of this? So this is another opiate that we need now that's 10 times more potent than Oxy. So, and it got approved by the DEA, even though the DEA scientists themselves said that there's no way that this drug should be approved. So there are powers here that are sort of beyond the capacity of sort of rational thinking, frankly. There's a lot of institutional, it's a big industry, the pain management. And so I think that's a challenge. As far as how do you treat people who have a history of addiction when you need to treat them for pain, well, there's another, that's going to be a problem, forever, essentially, right? So I think some of these ways, I think there needs to be more work in this area to try to figure this out. But I guess I'm not a big brain disease person, so I think that people have that are sort of predisposed to addiction. This can be a problem, but people who aren't predisposed get addicted, and people who are predisposed don't get addicted. So I think we need to be careful about putting these people over here that said, okay, well look out, this person, we can't do this with this person, or we can do this with this person. So I think treating pain that's a. We have any inspiring MDs here? You never hear about it, but I think pain management is a huge area that sort of could use some help.
Yeah, it's a great question. One answer is just to have doctors be more educated about addiction, right? It's always shocking how irresponsible and ignorant a lot of medical practitioners still are, unfortunately. About the disease and a lot of overprescription, or not even overprescription, just sort of like not thoughtful prescription can happen in that respect. Now, to the question of how people who are in recovery from addiction deal with having to take pain medication, right, which is a possibility, right? My own experience, I have not had to take pain medication, right, thus far. But if I did, there's a way you can do it responsibly, right? You've got to inform your doctor. Usually having my girlfriend or someone I'd give them the medication. You have a process and a procedure in place to make it, to do it right, you know what I mean? But people who are, a lot of it just depends on being open and honest with your doctor, which unfortunately people forget to be, and part of it is, recovery is really, it's a lifelong thing, right? There's no cure for addiction, right? It's really just something that I've got to continue to be cognizant of for the rest of my life, right? So, and I've known lots of people who've been clean for for long periods of time, and then sort of stopped doing the things they need to do to be in recovery, and then they get a sprained ankle or they break their, finger or whatever. They end up on pain medication, and then they're dead or their back strung out or whatever. So it's a tricky thing, but it's by no means insoluble. It just the large the doctors need to be more educated, and people that are in recovery need to take responsibility for their own recovery and be cognizant of that kind of issue.
And this may be made a little more complicated by the fact that I think one of the populations which is most at risk for addiction to prescription medication is physicians. Yeah. I believe these have been issues on medical staffs for a while. Professor Singer, did you? Okay, sir.
What went to supply reduction? Is there going to be an exacerbation in terms of disproportionality between particular demographics who are in terms of mandatory sentencing, dating back to the Nixon era and so forth? And how do we have a find an equilibrium, or is there going to be a paradox between supply reduction and treatment? There seems to be a disproportionality in terms of mandatory minimum sentencing, nonviolent criminals, and the exacerbation of mass incarceration. That there's vis-a-vis issues around applications for treatment. If we say that it is itself not perceivable or panacea, is the applications are the applications undermined, the lack of applications undermined?
Okay, so if I'm understanding the question, on the one hand, we know that there is a definite tendency for the enforcement of the supply reduction policies to disproportionately target minority and poor populations. On the other hand, and there can be claims that that the treatment programs are also insufficiently targeted to the minority and poor populations. So I guess the question that I would take from that is, first, is there, what do we know about the actual targeting of treatments? And also, if treatments don't work much, does that mean we shouldn't worry about targeting them, about who gets them, or is this nevertheless a serious concern? Taking for granted that we know that the enforcement, particularly the sentencing, which has tended to be stricter for minority and poor populations.
The first thing I'd say to that is there's no doubt in my own experience, and again, just my own. This is just my own experience, but drug trafficking tends to get focused in inner cities, right? And in populations which are predominantly in the cities which I'm familiar with, Chicago and Baltimore, most. I'm less familiar with how the drug market works in Cleveland, which Lee has a much better understanding of. But it tends to be concentrated in impoverished areas, which are disproportionately minority, right? And those areas essentially become drug markets, right? And there's that great David Simon book, The Corner, which I don't know if you're familiar with. They do a kind of ethnography, quasi-ethnography of a drug corner in Baltimore. And one of the things that'll happen is it's kind of a business center, and people in Baltimore, white people would drive from all over the state and from even Virginia and New Jersey, and they would drive to the inner city of Baltimore to get the drugs, right? So, and this was the major industry that was in that particular area, right? It was concentrated in that area. So that's, of course, where the police are focusing their attentions. Now, this is actually something that I'm really interested in for a variety of different reasons. But there's a distinction to be made between disproportionate enforcement that is caused by active discrimination and disproportionate enforcement that's a result of historical discrimination. In other words, the historical forces that led to the concentration of African Americans in inner cities and deprived those communities of access to work and so forth have resulted in a situation where, to some degree, and I'm not at all saying that cops aren't guilty of racism, of course they are, but to some degree, produce a situation in which for the cops, the logical area to focus on is the place where the drug markets are happening, which is in the inner city, right? So you get this outcome in which the legacy of American racism enters into this toxic synergy with America's drug addiction to produce this basically incarceration of generations of black men, right? So that's part of the situation we're dealing with, right? In terms of what the answer to that is, that's a tough problem.
because it's been a public policy from my recollection from Richard Nixon through Ronald Reagan. And is that policy malevolent, or is it benign or nuanced to have this emphasis relevant to what, in the context in which you speak?
Yeah, so Michelle Alexander has written this book, The New Jim Crow. Has anybody read this? So chapter 3 really gives you a great step-by-step process on the war on drugs and how it sort of basically incarcerated this whole entire generation of basically black men in the ghetto. So, you know, I think in some ways you go where the problem is and where you can see the problem, and that's what I think law enforcement does to some degree. However, I mean, the market's everywhere. You don't have to go to the ghetto to get drugs. In fact, most people don't do it that way. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to go there myself. I know, you know, these are dangerous places. And in fact, you know, customers are like you and I. I mean, you know, they're white middle-class people. They aren't going to go to those areas, because if they go to those areas, the cops are going to say, what in the hell are you doing in those areas? Or they're going to attract the police to those activities. So, you know, I think that we have this image that, you know, this is crack, you know, in the 80s or the 90s, where it was just sort of this street-based market. It's not like that really much anymore. And so I think it's just diffused, you know, it's dispersed all over the place. And so we need to be careful of using these tools that we've used, that were sort of inappropriately used anyway in the war on drugs, and to the wrong end. It's not like it worked for crack. So I think that we need to be careful here on how we approach it. Now, I think a really a positive thing is, this administration, current administration, has sort of ended the war on drugs. So it's sort of, they aren't using this language anymore. The former, I guess, DA has tried to change mandatory minimum sentencing for crack cocaine, and changing some of the requirements for the size of the amount of seized and jail sentences, and try to sort of do some work in this area. But a lot can be done, and the fact that now people, instead of going to jail, they can go to treatment, even though treatment doesn't work. It's better than jail, you know, because most of the time people go to jail, it's just they learn to become better criminals there. So, you know, it's not rehabilitation, it's just housing folks.
I kind of think fondly of my times in jail.
I think it's important to understand the range of effects on the racial distribution of prisoners and the people who are punished in the drug war, because a lot of it is actually the judicial system and the laws that were passed by the Congress, and especially by states. So, for instance, if you have, you know, more severe penalties for use of crack than of you know, powder cocaine, that happens to very much be biased against the population that is more likely to use crack and the less likely to use powdered cocaine, which tends to be black. When you have mandatory minimum sentencing, which is part of something much broader than simply the drug war, then again, you end up with people being sentenced for stuff who would not have been sentenced by the judges before. And so it's some of the things that have happened are not simply part of the war on drugs. They are part of the politics of crime in the United States, which I think has a very strong racial overtone.
I think it's hard to separate that. I mean, this is going back to the 70s, and it's all administrations have done things. You know, so there's this recent debate about whether people in Ferguson, Missouri, the Ferguson Police Department in Ferguson, Missouri, should be using these tanks and helicopters and things like this to quell civil protest, right? Well, they only have that equipment because Bill Clinton made it available to police departments in the war on drugs. So, and so it's not just one administration, and I think it's to say. I think it's been directed by the war on drugs. I don't think it's been sort of a partial player here.
And yeah, and the last thing I'll say about that is you know, again, and maybe have a perverse you know, impulse to think about the most complicated, or the least soluble dimension of problems. But part of it is, you know, I mean, the current, you know, racial geography of drug use and distribution in this country is, especially with heroin, is largely the product of, you know, American racial history for over 2 centuries, right? And so a lot of, policy gets at some of that, and we can blame policy over the last 2 decades for some of that, but there's a large part of that that is it wasn't created by those policies necessarily, and isn't transformable by changes in those policies. And yeah, so, and when I was in Baltimore, it really was, and this may be different in Cleveland, they were open air drug markets, and it was like lines of cars of people, middle class. I used to sell to, be involved with people who would be dealing to these like lawyers and doctors who would come down from or come up from Fairfax County in Virginia, and it was like BMWs, Mercedes, it was crazy. And the cops are just sort of like, they're sort of at a loss because they would move the spot. The cops show up at one spot, there's like 5 others that immediately pop up. So it was, I don't know if that's true in Cleveland. I don't think it is true in Cleveland, but there is that sense that the ghetto as a hub for drug distribution is still with us, at least in some parts of the country. Although in other drug, meth and so forth, it's obviously quite different.
I do think that if you want to think about the residue of other social issues in history, I suppose the fact that access to health insurance is also racially biased means that there'll be fewer minorities following the OxyContin and Percocet track into heroin because they won't have that medical care in the first place. Okay, I guess we got 2 more. This gentleman and you first, and then you. No, you. Yeah. Okay, so the question is the failure of treatment peculiarly high for heroin as opposed to other drugs?
Yes. It's the high, it's as I understand it, heroin is the most intractable to treatment. But there, addiction is a serious and complex problem that we're only beginning to understand, and we're nowhere near having an effective treatment for addiction as opposed to its symptoms, right? But recovery, yeah, it's always difficult, but the data suggests that heroin is the most intractable.
Mostly marijuana.
Yeah. The prison population is not a heroin population. A lot of it is other drugs. But then so recidivism in terms of going back to prison is one thing. Recovery in terms of the effective treatment is a different. Relapse. Okay. Well, right. I mean, if you're talking about people who arguably have a condition that needs treatment and are instead being put in prison, for marijuana or cocaine or whatever, yes, perhaps. I'm not sure what treatment for marijuana would be. So there's a whole lot of issues there that are not necessarily treatment issues. Yes, sir. Right, so there's a really good question here was, what are we doing when we call something an epidemic? Is that language appropriate? How does that shape how we talk about it? What do you think of calling it an epidemic as opposed to anything else? And since I came up with the title, I'll give the first answer, which is partly because I'm somewhat from a public health perspective. I used to teach at a public health school. There's a sort of default of calling things epidemics in order to get attention, right? That's what you do. You call things epidemics whether they are or they're not. On the other hand, if you see, I mean, technically what an epidemic would be some sort of individual level of event which is spreading and perhaps accelerating in a way that seems likely to accelerate some more without intervention. And I guess I would say that one could make an argument, particularly in terms of the fairly rapid observed increase in deaths from heroin in this area, that something is going on that may possibly, it might possibly be sort of legitimate to call it an epidemic.
Yeah, I mean, you know, based on any measure, this is an epidemic. I got news for you. So how people judge drug epidemics, and you could call it a trend too if you'd like, is you look at you look at indicators, right? So overdose deaths is an indicator, treatment is an indicator, emergency department mentions is an indicator, a law enforcement arrest is an indicator, and by all of these indicators, if you go to the Ohio has, so the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which is the Institute of Health that deals with addiction, created what's called the Community Epidemiology Work Group back in the 70s, which was a group of scientists nationally that looked at trends in drug use. So what's happening in different regions. I was a Colorado representative for a number of years. And some states had their own little epidemic organizations. The one here in Ohio is excellent. It's the OSAM, Ohio Substance Abuse Monitoring Network. And if you go to their website and look at some of those statistics on there, I mean, it's like, you know, I think it was 600% increase in the number of ODs over the course of a couple of years. The number of treatment entries is doubled as well. I mean, by any indication, this is an epidemic or a trend or however you want to talk about it. Epidemic is probably more useful here because these are health consequences that we're talking about, right? So even though a trend would be more of use oriented, so you would want to look at sort of more of the market, which is a little harder to measure because you're looking at things that are difficult to do, like drug retail prices, which are challenging to look at. But I don't think that there's any question that any epidemiologist in the state of Ohio would I think all of them would say that this is an epidemic, especially in southern Ohio. Southern Ohio has actually been much more affected than actually northeast Ohio. But
yeah, it's a great question. You know, I was just thinking like. If this is an epidemic, I mean, if you sort of take seriously that metaphor, or even further, think of it as a description, then what does that imply about causation here, right? What does that imply about how it spreads, right? What does that imply about the mechanisms of addiction, right? And you know, these are, I actually have no idea, right? I mean, in a sense, my sort of instinct is to say that if you increase the supply in an area, the epidemic will follow. You'll have more people who are addicts. But I'm not sure about how. I mean, supply and demand is a really kind of fascinating thing when it comes to you know, people use supply and demand as metaphors. We've got to attack supply or attack demand. It's really not clear to me that that we've thought enough about what that distinction actually means or what it looks like, right? I'm always a little bit uncomfortable about the epidemic language because I think it sort of presupposes answers to some questions that I don't think have been answered yet. But I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of look really interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I guess. I mean, you know, this is a social behavior. People don't decide individually to start using heroin. It's not an individual decision that I am making. So as far as an epidemic, this is a social epidemic, if you want to put it that way. People use by connecting with other people that are using, essentially. So you can think of it as social networks, however you want to think about the transmission. But this is an epidemic, folks. I don't think that, you know, we can think metaphorically about what does that mean, but I think there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that there are a lot more people using heroin now this year than 2011, and exponentially more. And so I think that we know enough to know that, you know, this travels in social groups, right? So it's a social drug, you know. So I guess that's what I would say.
Fine. There's a user, and for whatever the user's purposes and whatever effects on the user, and it is a social phenomenon. There's social effects, you know, on the user's family and on other people, But there's also, one has to have a market. One has to have, there are structures of human life built around being a user of the drug and procuring the drug and so on. And we have on campus in Professors Clune and Hoffer people with, fantastic perspective on both sides of this. Professor Clune, as a user, very distinguished professor of English and an amazing publication record. I can say that because I was on the promotion and tenure committee when his tenure case was reviewed. Really brilliant writer and all that. But he also, on the side, not as part of being an English professor, wrote this book, Whiteout: The Secret Life of Heroin, about his experience. Professor Hoffer has been studying drug markets since the early 1990s when he did a very long-term anthropological study of the Larimer area of Denver, and also published the overview of that research as a book, and has been continuing to work on the question of, basically how people procure heroin and what one can do about that and so on since then. So particularly the social side. And I don't want to make this too much of a false dichotomy here, right? Because you don't understand the social side unless you understand the incentives of the individuals, and you don't understand individuals unless you understand the milieu of the heroin life. But I do think that
into contact with both with my experience of addiction from the perspective of recovery, of living in recovery, and also to bring that experience into contact with scientific research and neuroscientific research in particular on the disease. So I want to just very briefly get things started by talking a little bit about the understanding of what addiction is all about that emerged from the process of writing about my experience with addiction. And again, I do want to stress that, because sometimes I think that gets lost. Just because I have experience at something, right, doesn't mean that my first-person account of that will offer any knowledge, right? As a literature professor and as someone who thinks a lot about what writing is and what writing does, I'm very interested in the passage from experience to knowledge and how writing can communicate and create knowledge. And so I'll share a little bit at the end points what I sort of discovered through that process, and I'd be happy to entertain questions about the process if that's of interest to anyone. So when we talk about addiction as a disease, right? And this is something that is often counterintuitive to people, right? For a long time, people thought that what addiction was about was that I did something, a drug or gambling or sex or whatever else. I had some consequences from it, but I liked the way it made me feel, therefore I continued to do it, right? This is a model that maybe, is a sort of common sense model. Like, heroin makes you feel good, you love the way it makes you feel, you don't like getting arrested and going to jail and all that kind of stuff and selling your TV and all that kind of stuff, but you like to feel good and that's why you do it, right? Turns out that's completely wrong. And actually that's the idea of what addiction was about that I had when I was an addict. And I'll talk a little bit about the way that addiction, part of what it does is it distorts one's own understanding of what one is doing, right? So what research has, over the last 2 to 3 decades, research has shifted from what the drug does when you take it, in other words, the way it makes you feel when you take it, to
Professor Clune and Professor Hoffer offer really unique and valuable perspective in these dimensions. So the way this is going to work is I've asked each of them to teach for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to pretend I'm James Lipton or something and pose a few questions to them and try to get them discussing with each other a little, and then we'll open it up some more for your questions. Because we are trying to record this, because we are recording this, as far as we know, when you ask questions, and because we only have one microphone, when you ask questions, I will restate the question back for the taped audience, and also so that in case anybody else had trouble hearing. So with that, I would like to turn over the microphone, literally, to Professor Clune.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Joe. Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. Thanks, Joe and Lee, for having this. I think it's timely, obviously. As Joe said, I come at this from my personal experience as a heroin addict, but I want to talk a little bit about the book that I wrote about it and about my process of coming to understand what my experience meant, right? So as an addict, I knew very little about addiction, right? I was sort of like the last person whose experience would be, whose sense of my own experience would be useful to people seeking to understand the disease of addiction. So if you'd asked me what addiction was all about, 13 years ago, you wouldn't have gotten anything very interesting, right? My process of writing about this happened after being clean and in recovery for a number of years. And when I wrote this book, what I tried to do was to bring my own experience in.
So, this on? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming on this beautiful warm day that's even warmer in here. I'm Joe White. I'm the director of the Center for Policy Studies and Luxembourg Family Professor of Public Policy and organizer of events for the Center for Policy Studies. And I am really, really pleased to be able to present to you today two of our really interesting scholars here at the Case Western Reserve University, Lee Hoffer from the Department of Anthropology and Michael Clune from the Department of English, to talk about something on which which is important and on which they both have pretty unique and valuable perspectives. There appears to be a new heroin epidemic. There has been a substantial increase in incidence of heroin usage and in deaths, particularly in Northeast Ohio, from heroin usage over the past decade. Something that I thought of as something in a Lou Reed song, that maybe we moved beyond. Apparently not. And so I thought it would be, and there have been, this has at a national level become more prominent because of, I guess, sentinel events such as the deaths of Corey Moncrief and Philip Seymour Hoffman. But as I said, it's pretty close to home as well. So it seems something that we should discuss on campus. I am afraid it may be a little too close to individual lives for comfort. And heroin use is an individual phenomenon.
To how the addict perceives the drug when they see it, right? Because the truth is, and this became true to me, clear to me once I reflected on my own experience of addiction. After a while, the drug high really kind of started to suck, right? It wasn't that great, right? It really stopped working for me. And you hear a lot of people describe that experience. It no longer gave me the feelings that it once gave me, right? So now I'm continually doing things and sacrificing and running risks in order to get a drug that doesn't make me feel much of anything, right? That's why we talk about it as a disease, right? So the question became why, the question of what the disease is shifted from the way it makes you feel to the way I perceive, as an addict, I perceive the addictive object. Why, after quitting heroin for so many, and I probably kicked heroin maybe 12, 14 times, something around there, but I always went back to it. And the question is, what was it that always drew me back, right? And it is something to do with the way the addictive object looks, with the way what I think when I see it. When I see, and I'm also an ex-smoker, and sometimes that's a useful, because more people are smokers than heroin addicts, it's a useful means I use to illustrate this, right? If one of you had dropped a cigarette pack out of your pocket, right? My eyes, as an ex-smoker, would be drawn to it. and it would have a kind of salience and a kind of intensity, the image of the cigarette pack, that nothing else has for me, right? I would also tend to look at that image and associate it with a kind of pleasure that smoking once gave me, like in the distant, distant past, right? So when I see my drug of choice, when I think about my drug of choice, what I see and what I experience is that first time, those great early memories of addiction, right? And it's like I'm unable to retain a really vivid memory of the pain and all the suffering that addiction caused in my life, right? So that's really the